Russ Kickle, and it's time for another episode of American Reef. Only today, we're not talking reefs, we are talking freshwater planted tanks. Just a reminder, if you are new to saltwater fish or coral reef keeping, be sure to check out my other 200, 300-ish videos that will teach you how to keep and maintain a saltwater or coral reef aquarium. If you're an iPhone, iOS kind of guy, you can find those out on the iTunes store. Just search for American Reef or saltwater on the iTunes music store. Same as it goes for Android. There's a podcast app or Pocket Cast app. Just search for American Reef or saltwater in there. Or if you're a YouTube kind of guy, I've got some videos, not a whole lot, but some out on the American Reef channel there. And lastly, you can go to AmericanReef.com, and from there I'll have all the video series as well. If you're looking for American Reef's HPD, again, while you're at AmericanReef.com, look at the bottom center of that page. There is a link that says, click here to purchase HPD. Get lots of emails on how to purchase it, and I guess I'm not too clear on where to find it, but if you're looking for it, click that link and that'll bring you to a page where you can purchase American Reef's HPD. Now in today's video, we're actually doing something totally different than saltwater. We're actually going to look at freshwater planted tanks. And again, most of us kind of started into this hobby by keeping goldfish, neon tetras, angelfish, those kind of things when we were younger, and became older. We kind of elevated our game, so to speak, and these planted freshwater tanks are kind of like a really nice throwback, but yet it complements what we were doing on the reef keeping side. And in today's episode, actually, Mike Paletta got that bug, and I think he got that after actually checking out Sanjay's freshwater planted tank. So I think one thing led to another. It got him rolling, and long story made short, through the winter months, he kind of planned out what we are going to see as his freshwater planted tank. And again, rather than me talk about it, let's just go check out Mike's tank and see what he's got cooking.
How are you today, Russ?
I'm doing fine, Mike. This doesn't look like a saltwater tank.
I know. I leapt off the reservation and decided to try something new. I pretty much have a freshwater tank, a frag tank, a nano tank, and a big SPS tank. There was nothing else I could think of to do, so I decided to do a plant tank. And actually, while I was traveling over the past few months, I went into a lot of shops and I saw a lot of really nice plant tanks. The technology has cut off to what we're doing with reef tanks, so I decided, no pun intended, to take the plunge and set up a plant tank. And after seeing these tanks, it is a much more relaxing kind of tank than is the coral reef tanks, in that the fish basically just swim from side to side. So it's kind of calm and relaxing. And as humans, we like green and yellow light, and so this is a green and yellow lit tank. So it's a lot different than the reef tanks that I'm used to doing.
And so I take it that's the episode for today, planted tank.
Today is my setting up a planted tank. It's only been up for approximately a month. As I learned with a reef tank, actually a lot of the things I learned doing a reef tank, I'm now using into the plant tank. The first of which is patience. It has taken me since the first of the year, it's now mid-April. It took me that long to set it up in terms of planning, in terms of getting the substrate, in terms of setting up the CO2 system, in terms of setting up the lighting, getting the fish. Everything has taken a lot longer than I would have expected from the old days when you'd buy a 10-gallon tank, walk home with 2 bags of fish and have it set up.
Okay, so planning. What was your first? Was it size? Was it height?
It was size to match where I had space. Behind or in front of me is my 70-gallon, which is soon going to be a 90-gallon soft coral tank. So this tank fit perfectly, for English-speaking friends, fit perfectly in this space. I wanted something a little bit taller than a typical shallow tank because I wanted to put angels in it. and I wanted something where I could let the plants grow up where I wasn't going to have to cut them every week. So I went with a taller rather than a shallower tank. And by having a less wide tank, I could also get away with using a single radion light. And amazingly, this was a light I had extra from my frag tanks. I put it on here, and it's been working absolutely perfectly. So I'm quite happy with that as the main source of light for this tank.
Okay, so now usually you have a give and take, right? So for your give and take for your taller tank, what are we talking? What was the? And I heard what you got out of it, but what's the negative aspect of it?
Negative aspect is the plants down at the bottom tend to get a little leggy. They start to lose leaves and stuff. So every few months you basically have to cut them back, pull up the roots, and replant the plants on the top healthy portion and let them reroot and regrow. It's just a little bit more maintenance, a little bit more work, but since you do a thicker substrate than I used to do, I mean the substrate here is about 3 inches, and since on the far right side of the tank there's the sort of loft going up, sort of a hillside, with the driftwood coming out of the side of the tank, I try to make it look kind of natural, like a bank. So there's a plus and a minus of doing it this way, but I kind of like how it overall looks.
Sure, I do. I like the taller tanks, period, right? And okay, so in your planning phase, did you have to worry about what kind of life you wanted to keep in it, or no?
I read up as much as I could on the plants and which plants would do well in this kind of tank. Obviously, this is primarily a South American, so it's a soft water, lower pH, high CO2 based tank. So I went with most of the plants from there, although I didn't do with any swords because swords just get totally out of control. So I'm not that fixed on where the plants came from, rather than I'm more fixed on how they look overall. So it's not a true Dutch tank. It's kind of like a hodgepodge, but I got the idea from a couple of shops that I went to. This was how their tanks looked, so I liked that. So that's pretty much what I've went with.
And okay, so then for planted tanks, you know how obviously with saltwater tanks and corals, you have to worry about, par values and things of that nature when you're planning out what you want to purchase. Do you have to worry about that?
You have to worry about par with CO2. If you run higher lights, you have to run higher CO2 because you have to sort of stay ahead of the algae. Right now, because this is still a fairly young tank, I'm still getting a fair amount of algae within the tank. I've put in some algae eaters like Tunze and nerite snails, and I'm probably going to put in a few mollies to help control the algae as well, which I'll eventually take out. But once you get the algae under control, then the plants really start to take off and thrive, and I haven't gotten there. It takes 3 to 6 months to get to that point. So by the end of the summer, I shouldn't have any algae problems anymore, and the plants should have taken off and be very luxurious and require a fair amount of work. Basically, trimming every 2 to 4 weeks, I'll be trimming back the plants. So once I get to that stage, I'll be quite happy, because this tank does have a fair amount of crypts in it. The crypts tend to grow fairly slowly, but once they take off and fill in the spaces, then I really won't have the algae problems. Right now, the crypts are kind of losing the battle with the algae, so I have to cut off the leaves and throw them away because they're covered with algae. But the new leaves that are coming up aren't getting quite as attacked by the algae. So the battle is raging, but it hasn't been lost yet.
Okay, so for the new guys, even though we're talking about planning, right? You mentioned some like definition kind of terms, like crypts, for example. Okay, give a list of the new terms that, if you're a new guy into this, mean something.
Crypts or cryptocorean, or I probably pronounced that wrong, but they're a slow-growing Southeast Asian plant. They're a leaf plant. They're sort of the Southeast Asian version of sword plants, except they grow much slower, and they come in a much more wide variety of colors. There's even rare crypts that cost as much as some of our corals.
Okay, so crypts are a plant. Which one's a crypt?
The plants here, where you see the leaves, and the plants over here. Now, the crypts are one type of plant. They're basically the rooted types of plant. Another type of plant is called a nubia. They are an even slower growing type of stem or of a rooted plant.
Okay.
And they primarily like even lower light than the crypts do. So you can put them under overhangs, underneath the driftwood. They grow very slowly. They're very prone to getting covered with algae, so you have to keep them in areas where they're not going to get algae problems, or you have something to clean them off.
So which one's the nubia?
That's the one in the back wall, or the one way underneath the rocks. It's basically hidden. Okay. Now, for the most part, what you usually use in a lot of these tanks are stem plants. That is what we typically think of as bunched plants. They grow much faster, they take a lot of the nutrients out much quicker, and those are the plants that help you combat the algae. You want to start off with a lot of those initially to help combat the algae, then over time you kind of take some of those out and you put in some of the slower growing plants once you've got the algae under control.
Now, you lost me on bunched plants. What
They were what we used to, the old bunched plants that we used to have when we were kids, like anacris and things like that. Used to come in a bunch with a rubber band on the bottom.
Yes.
Those are stem plants. Those are the plants
Got it.
we use at the bottom, like this Diplus diandra, stuff like that, or Bacopa carolina.
Hold on. Okay, which one's a dipless and what's a
The
copa?
Diplus diandra is the thin-leafed one
Okay,
up in
yes.
the front, and then the bigger one is Bacopa carolina.
Say that 10 times.
Yeah, I know. And then there's Rotella wallicki, which is the really fine needle-leaved plant. And then the red plant is Ludwigia, super red they call it, because it stays really red. You don't want to have too many red plants in the tank, but you want some for contrast.
So why don't you want too many?
It just sort of takes away the overall
for
view
look.
of the tank.
Okay, so it's
for
the
look
appearance.
more than anything.
Okay, got it.
So I don't have a ton of those, but I have enough right now where it's growing in. And then I also have Blixia japonica, which is this grassy thing over here to fill in the one side and eventually along the back, so it'll kind of hide where the driftwood is coming out of the wall.
Yep.
So the look is to try and give it, make it look bigger than it is, and that's why the back is black and why the one side is black. Also to cut down on sunlight coming in, because just like in a coral reef tank, if you have sunlight, particularly initially, you'll get a lot more algae problems because you're not controlling the light. So from that standpoint, that's why I put the black around it. Plus, it makes the tank look better. It adds to the depth and adds to kind of the, for lack of a better term, mystery of the tank.
Sure.
So
now, do you have the same algae kind of problems that you would have on a saltwater tank as far as the glass goes?
the glass I clean once a week versus for whatever reason, I don't have my phosphate. It's at 0 here or in those tanks, and you're not supposed to have the phosphate at absolute 0 in any of them.
Right.
Because the plants need phosphate for their fertilizer, just like you fertilize your yard with phosphate. Same thing here. The plants need some phosphate in the water. If I control the phosphate, keep it about the same level, 0.03, 0.05, 0.02, so there is some phosphate in the water. And by keeping that under control, in this tank I have to clean the glass once a week. In my saltwater tanks, even at that low phosphate levels, I clean the glass every day, every other day.
Right.
And I found that the corals do better if I'm cleaning the glass, and I have to clean the glass regularly. If the glass is spotless for a week, the corals just seemingly are starving. There just isn't enough nutrients in the water for them. So I've gotten accustomed to cleaning the glass on a regular basis, and I'm quite happy with that now because there's a lot of easy glass cleaning products out there.
Right. Okay, so hold it. So with phosphates on a planted tank, is that little Hanna photometer?
Use the same test for both.
Okay, so it
it's
works
one of the
on
nice
both.
things I can use. They're still testing for phosphate.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I actually help maintain a tank at a hospital, and the hospital staff decided that every time they walked by and the fish acted hungry, they would feed them. They got the phosphate levels up to 2.5, not 0.025.
Right.
And the tank, they basically lost everything. The tank went into a full-blown bacterial bloom, and all the fish, for lack of a better term, died as a result. So once again, you don't overfeed, but keeping the phosphate levels at a reasonable level will help this establish itself and help combat the algae.
Okay, so again, back to that kind of planning phase. When you were planning for the plants, right? Are there some plants, to your point earlier, that will take more phosphates out of the water?
To be honest, I don't know.
Okay.
What I did was I tried to get an assortment of plants. I read a lot in the plant blogs, because there's just like coral reef blogs. There's plant blogs that give you an idea of, and they give you diagrams of what you might come up with. And from that, I derived what I wanted to do and where I wanted to plant it. And what's interesting is when you plant the plants initially, you basically drain the water down to nothing. And then you plant the plants in more or less a moist substrate. So in that way, it's a lot easier to get the rooted plants in. If you're constantly doing this in a deep water tank, it doesn't work.
Right.
So it's a lot easier than it used to be when I used to reach in this far and try to plant the plants.
Right. Okay, so that begs the question, the water that you fill it up with, is it RODI water as well? Or?
It's probably 80% RODI, 20% tap water that's been treated for ammonia and chloramine.
Sure.
So I don't want absolute 0 RODI water, but I do want soft water. So I have found that ratio here with what my tap water is gives me the 3 to 4 DKH, which is what I'm looking for.
Okay. And did you find that out just by experimenting?
Yeah, okay. I took buckets of water, started with RODI straight, and then gradually added tap water to see where I got it to the right point.
Right.
And I do, on this, I do a regular 20-gallon water change. It's roughly a 60-gallon tank. I do a 30% water change once a week.
Nope.
It takes about 45 minutes to do. It actually takes longer than it does to do the 25 gallons on the...
Right, because you got to worry about sucking out all the plants, right?
and sucking out all the fish.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, because
sure.
freshwater fish aren't quite as smart as saltwater fish, so they tend to go right in the hose. So, I've had to learn to do that.
Okay, so you're still doing your water changes on it, and with your water changes, sometimes
I'm taking off the mulm in the bottom. I'm trying to take out as much algae as I can. Because here they have what it's called thread algae, or hair algae, or thread algae, and it's as thin as the hair on my head, which is the very thin.
Right.
But it's kind of sticky, and it grows through and around everything. It's the real bane of people that have planted tanks.
Right.
So every time I do a water change, I try to suck out as much of that as I possibly can. Because again, the battle is between algae and the plants.
Right.
So over time, hopefully that will become less and less of a battle, and the plants will win. But as I said, this is a new tank, so right now the algae's holding its own.
Okay, so back to that planning phase with kind of like the fish, for example. Do you have to select certain fish that will not eat certain plants, or how does that work?
Most fish aren't going to eat the plants that go in here.
Okay.
I mean, there's a book on nano fish to go into the tank. Obviously, I didn't go with all nano fish because I have some angelfish, which definitely aren't nano.
Right.
But I went with schools of fish, which is also nice in these tanks because it's very relaxing to watch a school of fish all swim together. There's a school of cardinals. There's roughly 20 cardinals. There's 11 traditional rasboras, and there's 20 ember tetras. So those schools sort of all hang out together. They all eat about the same sized food. They all like the same kind of water. So from that context, I try to make it as close as I can. Obviously, the rasboras don't live with the tetras in nature, but I'm not going for a natural tank per se. I'm going for something that I enjoy looking at, and those are the fish that I like looking at.
Right. Okay, so with the angels, for example, were those out at Wet Pets? Those angels?
These are the tank bred ones that Brian does a really nice job of breeding the nicest ones. Basically, what I have is 8 of them in here. When they grow up in size, I will trade them back. I'm basically renting these to grow out for Brian and bring them back to him because he can't grow all the nice ones. So he let me pick out the nicest 8 that I wanted. When I grow them out to roughly the size of a silver dollar, they'll go back and I'll put in more small ones. So that way I don't want these fish, once they get into breeding, just eating the cardinals and the tetras and everything else out of the tank, which is what they'll do.
Okay, so then from a planning purpose, again, as it relates to fish, you're saying, again, you can pick and choose, per se. You don't have to worry about them necessarily eating the plants.
Per se. I mean, if you put in plecostomus, some of the plecostomus will eat some of the plants. Some of the other fish will nip at them. But most of the fish that we now have for these tanks aren't going to bother them. Obviously not going to put in like silver dollars or stuff like that, which would ravage this kind of tank. But there's more fish than I ever could imagine. I mean, one of the people that got me doing this was actually Sanjay, because he has a really nice planted tank, and his is low maintenance as well. I mean, this sounds like a lot of maintenance, but reality, it's an hour a week of maintenance for this tank, which to me is pretty much time well spent. Because it's kind of relaxing time. It's not, where the coral fell over and killed this. It's more controlling the environment by just doing the water change on the plants and taking the algae out.
Sure. Let's take a break and see what Lucy's barking at.
Yep. Now, before I continue, one of the things I will point out is I'm not an expert in this. I don't claim to be an expert in this. This is sort of a hobby within the hobby. This is something new to play with, and it's just kind of relaxing for me because, as most of us have started off with freshwater tanks. I mean, I had those as a really young kid, really long time ago. So that's why I'm just doing this. So I'm just sharing my experiences with you guys, and this is, to me, something fun. Obviously, the reef tanks are fun to me as well, but this was just something to keep me busy over the winter, because if you lived on the East Coast, you know how miserable winter was. This was just something to keep me occupied and keep my hands in the tanks, because my other tanks basically were so full of stuff, there was really nothing else I could put in them, which sounds funny to say, but I'm admitting I've pretty much run out of room. As you'll see in the other videos that we're shooting today, the tanks are as jam-packed as they've ever been.
No.
I know you find it
me.
hard to believe. I am a
No,
coralaholic.
geez.
I freely admit that. And I mean, that's why I once had a 1,200-gallon tank that was totally packed.
Right.
So I swore I wouldn't do that with a 300, but I lied.
Yes, and then some. And then you said you wouldn't do it with the Nano, and we'll show everybody how you lied.
Yeah.
Right.
So, I mean, this tank isn't as packed, but it is. But it has nice schools of little fish. They're not going to get any bigger. They're basically going to stay pretty much the same size, and I'm not planning on putting anything else in the tank. So this is going to be one of the more stable tanks that I have, because I can't really be cutting this stuff and trading it like I do with the corals and moving stuff around.
Right.
Here, it's pretty much as it is. And it's nice because I can look at it from the front while I'm over there watching TV, or when I eat breakfast or a meal, I look in the side, so I get different views of the tank, and I keep a pretty close eye on it. So far, after 6 weeks, I really enjoy this tank, and everybody that has seen it, compared with the other tanks, are going, yeah, that's really cool, because it's such a different perspective, and the lush greenness, compared with the blue lights and the bright colored corals, it's a totally different system. So, I mean, if you get tired of the reefs, this is just something else to consider. It's something else to drive your wife or your significant other crazy with, that you're not going to do that. But since I live alone, I can set up as many tanks as I want.
Yeah, heck yeah.
So this was something I always wanted to do, and now the technology has caught up with me, and I had a lot of spare parts sitting around, like the solenoid for the CO2 system, the extra radion light. The only thing I really had to buy was the stand, the substrate, which is fluorite and Carib Sea's plant medium, and some laterite for the bottom. I really didn't have to go crazy with stuff. I mean, it's still expensive, but it's not like setting up a reef tank. It's about half the price of what it would be to set up a comparable reef tank.
Right.
So from that standpoint, then the CO2 is on a system where it kicks on about an hour and a half before the lights come on, and it kicks off a half an hour before the lights shut off. So I try to maximize the amount of CO2. And you want to have, there's a very fine line between too much and too little CO2. And I found out, not the hard way, but pretty close yesterday morning when I came downstairs, all the fish were at the surface because there was too much CO2 in the tank, because the plants were really taking off. So at night, I had to run a power head with air to drive off some of the CO2. So this morning they were all fine. Yesterday morning, I've never seen all my fish at the very surface. And needless to say, there's a lot of fish in this tank when you see them all at once at the surface of the tank.
No, that's right.
So those are just some of the pitfalls of this tank, is understanding CO2 and not doing too much, and understanding that you're going to battle algae at the beginning, no matter how meticulous you are, no matter how, I mean, I had algae in this tank when I put absolutely nothing in this tank that could generate algae. Driftwood, substrate, and rocks, none of which had algae. Somehow I was still growing algae on the driftwood. Even though I had cured the driftwood and soaked it, I was still growing algae. So there's algae spores that are going to grow everywhere. So for that, there's the Octodocinclus and the Nerite snails. And like I said, I'm probably going to put some mollies in to help win that battle. And then once everything's under control, I can take a lot of that stuff out and just let it go.
Right. And okay, so we were talking a little bit about planning, for example, and you were talking about as far as, from a fish perspective, right?
Well, first, from a plant perspective, you diagram out how you're going to put everything. So I had a nice diagram, and it was actually life-sized, of where I was going to put all the plants, where the driftwood was, where the rise was going to be in the tank, because it's not all just flat bottom like it used to be. There's areas where it raises up in the back, where I have some crypts that grow slower that are eventually fill up the back wall of the tank. So from that standpoint, I drew and diagrammed everything at life size. Then I put in what plants were going there, and then I read everything I could on different fish, and I saw a lot of tanks with fish. Cardinal tetras, when I was a kid, we used to go to a store called Frank's Aquarium in Nature in the Heights, and Frank had what at that time was an enormous, for me, 120-gallon tank with black gravel, with Vallisneira growing everywhere in it, and a school of 200 cardinal tetras. And to me, it was still the most, when I saw that tank, it was like, that's what I want.
Me too.
So this is obviously a smaller version of that, but I knew I wanted cardinal tetras. And when you have cardinal tetras, then you think of angelfish. I always like the Harlequin rasboras. There's hatchetfish, and Brian had these ember tetras that are kind of small and don't really look like much, but when they get about another ½ inch, they turn kind of a cherry red, and it'll be a nice contrast with the other fish in the tank. So that's basically it for the tank. Sanjay has a ton of nano fish in his tank. He has celestial dinios. He has the really cool pencil fish, the new ones that come in that are the purple ones. What else? Oh, he has the Asian rummy nose rasboras, which are really cool. He has a lot of cool loaches. So there are a lot of
Right.
really nice fish you can put in this tank.
Right.
So now I'm thinking, well, should I do another planted tank with
Yes.
those fish, or another little nano tank, like a little tank to
Yes.
put on the island here
Yes.
that's 10 gallons and put some of those fish in it. So that may happen down the line, but for a while, I'm just going to enjoy this tank. That may be a next winter project because now there's enough technology and enough miniaturized stuff that. When I was in San Francisco, I went to this plant store or this aquarium store
Right.
that is nothing but planted tanks, and they had little 5 and 10 gallon tanks that had as much technology as this did on it.
Right.
And they had really cool little tiny fish. When I say tiny, I mean little tiny,
Right.
nothing bigger than half an inch, but they were as brightly colored as some of our saltwater fish.
Right.
So that may be something to look at down the line.
Okay, so you keep on mentioning technology. Let's talk about the technology on the tank. Okay.
Okay.
So you said you have a light. It was
I'm
the
running
Radion.
a Radion LED, the
Right.
single versus the double. It's in the center of the tank. It produces enough light. Usually they want about 450 par.
Mm-hmm.
We usually run 600 on coral, so I have this running at about 80%,
Okay.
85%. Right now I'm only running it for 6 hours a day because, as I said, there's a balance between more light, more CO2, battle with the algae. So I'm running it for a shorter photo period to try and reduce the amount of time that the algae can
Right,
thrive.
right.
So eventually over time I'll get it up to 8 hours, which is what I'm looking forward to.
Right.
So that's on all their EcoSmart system, and they have a plant template. That's what I'm running it off of.
Mm-hmm.
So it produces a really nice color. The plants have done really well. I have pictures from 3 weeks ago where none of the plants were higher than this.
Right.
So in 3 weeks they've grown all the way to the surface. So once they take off and root and thrive, I mean, it's
Right.
amazing how fast plants grow.
Hold on, real quick. How long do they take to root? You know, I mean, because in my mind it's
From-
like 14 days, but I don't know if that. Wow.
Yeah, from the plant stores where I've bought them from, they said figure 2 to 3 weeks till they really start to root and take off. So they rooted because of the good substrate that I used in 2 weeks,
Right.
and in the past week is when they've really started to take off and grow.
And when you planted them, did you have to actually crop back any of the roots, or did you just
I
plant them?
cropped off the side roots off of the stems,
Okay.
so that they were clear without roots. Then
Yep.
everything else just went in, and because it was low, I could basically put my finger in the substrate, put the root in, put the stem plants in, and then seal the substrate around them. So it's pretty easy and straightforward doing it that way versus having to fight water and the buoyancy effect of the plants, because most of the plants want to float in the tank.
Sure, sure. And back to technology. So that's how you're lighting it.
Then there is two power heads, one that runs all the time, one that runs at night to drive off the CO2 so there's not too much at night. It runs for about 10 hours a night. Then there is a Fluval or Marineland canister filter in the bottom. And what's in there are bio balls, carbon, a filter pad, and I also have Miracle Mud in there.
Okay.
As I saw, I know everyone's going, "Ooh, he's still using Miracle Mud." I saw Ling's planted tanks using Miracle Mud, and it releases iron and some other micronutrients in the tank very gradually. The plants were as lush as possible. But the thing that really sold me is there was a pet shop near where he lived that had two that raised discus like Brian does. One tank had a mud system on the discus, and the other system did the traditional way of raising. Same food, same water. One was with the mud system, one was without. The discus in the mud filter were twice as big and looked like adults in coloration when they were only this big, versus the other discus were about the size of a dime in the same 3-month time period. So seeing how fast the fish grew and how healthy they were, I decided to use the Miracle Mud in this system as well.
Right. So again, you have the Marineland canister filter. How do you keep the mud from kind of like,
It's basically in a filter bag.
Okay.
So it just flows through, and there's sponges on either side of it. So the flow through that is not that strong. It's just going to dissolve it all and shoot it into the tank. Compare with how much flow we get
Right.
in a reef tank, the flow in here is very gradual. Most of the fish are not used to getting blasted like they are in a reef tank. So the flow is very gradual. I mean, it's probably only 800 gallons per hour with everything in this tank. So it's very low compared with a reef tank. So all the other technologies is a heater, and down below I use the same individual flipper switches. So when I do a water change, I can turn off the heater, the pumps, and the canister filter, do the water change, and flick them all back on one at a time. So instead of doing all at once, because that way the CO2 system stays on, I'm not really having to change anything, the light stays on, The only thing that goes off are the things I want to go off.
Okay, let's talk a second about the CO2 system. So for the CO2 system itself, okay, you were saying you basically got kind of 2 drips per second. I mean,
I'm running 2 bubbles per second, and there's a little device on the far left of the tank that's an indicator that shows you whether your CO2 levels are adequate, inadequate, or too high. And you want to keep it in the green. So it's a fairly simple, straightforward system. And one of the things that the plant people told me is when you want to battle, when you have bright lights like this, and you want to battle algae, you have to make sure your CO2 system is maximized. So I'm running as high as CO2 as I can so that the fish aren't at the surface of the water. So I get real close to that level, but obviously during the day when the lights are on, the plants are producing oxygen, so they're not going to go that way. And by the end of the day, some of these plants you'll actually see O2 bubbles coming out of them. You'll see them producing oxygen. That's how much CO2 is in there. But then at night, obviously, they're consuming oxygen. That's why their fish are at the surface. So that's why I'm driving off the CO2 and adding oxygen there, because CO2 dissolves very readily in water. That's why one of the things we worry about in the reefs now is acidification of the coral reefs in nature. With a higher incidence or higher amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, it's being absorbed or dissolving in the ocean, so the ocean is becoming more acidic over time. So in this tank, all there is a solenoid. As I said, the solenoid is on a timer. Timer kicks on an hour before the lights come on and kicks off an hour before the lights go off. So I'm maximizing the amount of CO2. It's about 2 bubbles per second. And I'm running a glass diffuser, which takes the bubbles and makes them into even finer spray. And those are getting sucked into the marine land canister filter. So I'm trying to dissolve as much CO2 as I can in the system, because if you let the CO2 just stay in one big bubble and go to the surface and break, it's not dissolving in the water, so it's not doing any good. So you do the diffuser, and I have it drawn into the canister filter to try and maximize the dissolution of the CO2.
I never knew the fact that even though it hit the water column, that, you know, if it burst on top, that it would go away, which makes sense.
Yeah, it's not going to dissolve. It's just burst in the atmosphere.
Sense, right.
So you want a fine bubbles. That's why you run the little fine diffusers, or they make all kind of different ways to dissolve the CO2 before you're in there. So I'm not running the big CO2 bottle like I am in the basement. I'm running a little 2.5 pound bottle, and it's been on for 6 weeks, so we'll see how long it lasts.
And Powerhead, you said what kind of flow are you running through this tank?
It's running about 800 gallons per hour. It's not blasting it. I mean, it's a relatively gentle flow. I mean, you can barely see the plants moving in the tank, and you can barely see the surface being agitated. It's just enough to keep water moving. And the other thing is, I've been told more flow also helps reduce the amount of algae, so that's the other reason why there's a second Powerhead in there. Sure.
And do you have to worry about like surface skimming, for example, like you do in a saltwater tank?
You do get accumulation of oils on the top. So when I'm doing the water change, I take all that off. And once a week, I go in and I skim off any dead leaves and stuff. So doing that twice a week, I kind of take the oils off and allow for the surface area to be pretty much free. I did a water change on Saturday, and you can see the top of the water is basically clear of any oils right now.
Right. And now, one of the things I remember growing up, whenever I had a freshwater tank, I always had problems with like cloudiness per se. Do you have that same kind of issue?
You can have that issue. As I said, that the tank that was in Butler was as cloudy. It was like milk. I mean, it was like someone had dumped a gallon of milk in there, and that was a bacterial bloom. You either get cloudiness from bacterial blooms or from not having the calcium and carbonates in the proper balance. So as long as you keep those balanced, you get a great deal of clarity. Plus, I run carbon that I change out once a month. Actually, I should do it every 2 weeks, but I've changed the intakes on the marine land canister filter. Did not have shutoff valves, and they wanted like $15 a piece. So I used my knowledge of working with PVC, and I built them for $5 a piece from the parts I got at Lowe's. Right. So now I can shut it off, take it off, and clean it off a lot easier. So I'll probably change the carbon out once every couple weeks now. That will also keep the water crystal clear.
Sure. And do you have to worry about the shocking, for example, the plants like you do in a saltwater tank? You
still should acclimate, and they still don't really do well if you bring them from extreme cold. That's why in the wintertime it's very difficult to get a lot of plants because they don't ship very well. They don't ship them underwater, they ship them dry, and they're exposed to temperatures even though they're shipped in styrofoam. So they're not quite as hardy as like this time of year when it's 70 degrees out and it's perfect. Right. So those are the things you do want to acclimate the plants gradually, or I prefer to buy them locally and after they've had them in the tank for a while and you can see that they're thriving. it's a lot better than buying them online.
And the acclimation, when you change carbon, for example, from a clarity, like again, I know some people have lost your saltwater tanks because
It's not as readily apparent because the water is pretty clear here compared with a saltwater tank when you're changing the carbon.
Got it.
And you're not changing a huge quantity of carbon. I mean, I'm probably doing 50 to 75 grams of carbon on this.
Got it. So hardly.
Yeah, so it's just enough to take the edge off the clarity, but it's not enough to really do as much as we do in a saltwater tank.
And now, what about as far as feeding goes?
I tend to overfeed, but as I showed you earlier.
No.
But what you need to do is a pinch, and I feed this tank fairly often because it's so convenient. So I try to do a little pinch like 8 times a day, because when you see how tiny these fish are, their stomachs and digestive tracts are just as tiny. So they don't really need that one huge meal. It shouldn't be Thanksgiving for this tank every day. It should be appetizers constantly. So this tank gets fed 6 to 8 times a day, small amounts, and so far I've been fortunate in that I haven't lost any fish. So I have to assume I'm feeding it the right amount, and the water chemistry has stayed stable. I mean, I test this like I do my other tank twice a week. Test pH, test hardness, test general hardness, test iron, and test ammonia. And doing all those, once the tank is established and the pants are going, you shouldn't have to worry about ammonia. But I still do that. I also test phosphate and nitrate, because you can't have them at absolute zero. You still want to have 10 parts per million of nitrate, 0.03, 0.05, you know, up to 0.1 of phosphate. And by doing that, the plants will thrive.
Good deal. And so again, how many weeks are we into this?
With all the fish in it, it has only been 3. The plants have been in for about 4.
Okay.
So this is still really a baby tank.
Right. So I guess the idea would be maybe like a 6-month. We'll come back. We'll take a look at it. And,
Yeah, 3 to 6 months. I mean, it should be pretty well. I mean, if I had to replace all the fish, obviously I'm doing something wrong. Some of the plants will have changed out because I'm probably going to go more toward the more crypts and stuff like that. As the algae gets under control, I can go to things that are easier to maintain and I'm not having to trim all the time. That's what the goal is like Sanjay has a very low maintenance tank. It's all primarily crypts and anubias and java ferns. And so he basically never has to trim stuff. When you have stem plants that go to the surface in a week, you have to do more work. So right now, until I get the algae under control, I'm doing the more work. Hopefully by the end of the summer I won't have to do that. I'll have more crypts in and it'll be a much fuller and nicer tank in that regard.
Okay, so before we kind of sign off, as it relates to the things that you would do differently now that it's 6 weeks later, what would that be?
Really nothing. I'm pretty happy with how it looks. I mean, I probably would have battled the algae and added more algae eaters when I just put the plants in, because I didn't think in a week how fast algae could take off in this kind of tank. That's the only thing I didn't do, but I did have the nerites in there, but they don't eat the thread algae and they don't eat some of the bushier algae that grow in the crypts leaves. So I would have added the mollies earlier and I would have added something else to eat them earlier. Okay. But other than that, I'm pretty happy with how it looks, how it's growing, and I mean, the response that everyone that has seen it has been very positive.
Yeah, I love it.
Yeah.
Okay, so as far as how many algae eaters per se you added, how many did you add to that tank?
I added a dozen nerite snails and 10 oto cinchlus.
Right.
I probably would have added a couple bristlenose plecostomas. I probably would have doubled the amount of nerites, and I probably would have added maybe 5 more otocinchlus. But I would have also added like half a dozen mollies right from the get-go.
Right.
That probably would have made a huge difference.
Right. Okay. And then on the opposite side, what do you find that you like, best about it, or maybe an advantage that you get now that you didn't expect to have before?
It's nice because of the view from over the side that I get to see this, and I was smart to not put in really dense plants over here so I can look into the tank. Knowing that I have to cut all this back fairly frequently, I knew that going in. I can't believe how fast stuff grows in this tank. It's going to be curious to see how fast the fish grow, particularly the angelfish, compared with what I've had in the past where they grew at a snail's pace. I'm assuming they're probably going to grow fast here, and I'll be trading them out to brine by probably the middle and end of the summer, which is a good thing to do, but those are the kind of things I'm looking forward to seeing. And being able to keep cardinal fish alive for a year, 2 years would be nice. And I'm also hoping because of the bushiness of the plants and the health of the plants, that some of these fish will spawn in here.
Sure.
So that'll be interesting to see as well. So it's something different to do, and it's kind of entertaining. And the people that have come over and said, this is so different for you.
Right.
But everybody sort of has had an aquarium at some point in their lives. So from that standpoint, it's bringing back people a lot of nostalgia. Like, oh, I didn't know you could do this, or those plastic plants. And I go, no.
Right. Right. Yeah, especially for me. Like I said, as soon as I saw it, I'm like, ah. Okay. Before I forget, I wanted to ask, as it relates to kind of your best resources that you found, right? Obviously, you bought a lot of stuff from Wet Pets, as far as the fish, but a lot of people
Wet Pets, and Oddball Pets, both in Pittsburgh, both have a lot of plants, have a lot of nice fish for this kind of tank. I was on the Aquarium Plant blog, and just doing reviews online, just Googling stuff, how to get rid of hair algae, best catfish for eating hair algae, just doing what's in your mind. I mean, you can Google search it and find out virtually everything you need, and finding different foods. Like, I'm still amazed that they don't make, there's no longer any frozen mosquito larvae, which is what I fed the fish growing up. No one manufactures that anymore. Now it's frozen bloodworms, but the problem is over time, frozen bloodworms tend to cause the fish to have fatty livers, so you can't feed those all the time. So I'm using a lot of the pellets, like the Thera A, which I use for the plants. I use the micro pellets Thera A here, which is what Brian uses to keep his cardinals and other small fish happy. I'm also using the Hikari brand stuff, and I'm using some of the Tetra Flakes. So there's hopefully enough nutrition in those, but I'm used to feeding frozen foods. Right. So I'm feeding Cyclops and Daphnia and microworms, mini microworms, not even the big microworms, but mini bloodworms, things like that. And I mean, obviously the fish seem to love it. So the key for me is not to feed as often as I traditionally do for a coral tank, but to feed little tiny amounts often. Because as soon as they see food, they all come up. So,
well, it sounds like a good place to cut it. And what we'll do is we'll do like a 6 month, and we'll see.
We'll see if I still have it.
Thank you, Mike.